Welcome to Businessworld's series on public policy, Policy Matters. I am the executive editor for public policy, Neeta Misra, and I'm very pleased to have with us today Professor Andrew Scull, who is a distinguished research professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego. Hi, Andrew, and welcome to the series.
Thank you, Neeta. I'm very pleased to be here with you to talk about what I think are a very important set of issues, both historically and in our world today.
Tell us a little bit about the research you've been doing for almost 50 years on mental illness.
Yes, well, that reminds me of how ancient I'm now becoming. When I started out work in this area back in the early 1970s, it was to study how it was that psychiatry as a profession came to be in 19th century Victorian England, and how the asylum, which was where psychiatry got its start, came to be. What led societies, not just England, but all across the developed world, to invest in the asylum as the solution to the problems posed by serious mental illness. And how was it that we were persuaded that this was preeminently a medical problem, something that should be put in the hands of members of the medical profession, and that mental illness was something that could be understood and treated within that medical framework? From there, I actually, when I went out on the job market, I was in sociology departments, and increasingly they wanted to know about what was going on in the contemporary world, not back in 19th century England. And many of them said to me, well, you must be very pleased these asylums are vanishing, or what do you think should be happening now? And I thought, well, I really ought to look at that. I'd been so immersed in the 19th century, I had not looked at what was going on around us. And I thought, there's so much social, economic, intellectual capital invested in the asylum system. Surely it can't be just vanishing off the face of the earth. So in the mid-1960s, mid-1970s, forgive me, I looked at that problem. Was it really the case that we were abandoning the asylum? And the answer was yes. It did seem as though we were, and within a couple of decades, that was even more obvious. The buildings were literally being abandoned, were falling down, or being converted to other uses. So if so, why was that happening, and what were the likely consequences for people with serious mental illness? So that was a very contemporary framed analysis that took place when community care was being touted as a great reform. And as we may have occasion to talk later this morning, I was quickly led to the conclusion that that was emphatically not the case, that community care was largely a myth. There wasn't much community, and there was very little, if any, care in return for the collapse of the asylum. So from there, I'd originally not thought I would spend my entire life obsessed with the problem of mental illness, but so it proved. If you pick something that's a sufficiently compelling intellectual puzzle, and one that also has such profound social implications for everybody in society, that leads inevitably to, as you acquire more knowledge and more intellectual capital, to finding new avenues to pursue. And I first went back to the 18th century and looked at doctor-patient family relations in London, surrounding with the most eminent mad doctor of mid-18th century England, John Monroe of Bedlam or Bethlehem Hospital. And then I moved into the 20th century, and that occurred in the early 1980s, when the history of the last century's approaches to mental illness was something almost completely understudied, if not studied at all. And at a time at the Wellcome Institute, where I was there on a Guggenheim fellowship, I was reading about some of the therapeutic interventions that took place in the 1920s and 30s. Things like insulin coma therapy, surgical evisceration of patients in pursuit of so-called focal sepsis, giving them shocks either via an injection of a chemical into their bloodstream or electricity, and of course lobotomy. And I thought, well, these were pretty desperate remedies for this condition, which in retrospect, with the single exception of ECT, have been abandoned and are now seen as catastrophic blind alleys. But how did that happen, and why did that happen? So that was the origins of this book. But I wrote many others along the way. I kept coming back to research on this as I'd be in relevant archives. I would look for material. Sometimes I spent 6 or 8 months working on it, but it became increasingly apparent to me that I ought not to stop with these developments in the early 20th century, because it was easy to dismiss them as the prehistory of a pre-scientific psychiatry. And we'd moved to a world now of the laboratory and of genetics and of neuroscience and of psychopharmacology. And so anything that just treated those early 20th century experiments was going to be easily dismissed. And I by then thought a more comprehensive look at where American psychiatry came from, how it had evolved, and why it had evolved as it did, why mental patients were so vulnerable to experimentation, and what had happened in the last 50 years or so. This was returning in a way to the question of the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, the abandonment of segregative responses, asylums, or mental hospitals as they'd been renamed. And so some of it was looking again at this problem of what had happened to the treatment of serious mental illness from the 1960s onwards. But this was also obviously an era where psychiatry tried to embrace the laboratory and science. That was particularly noticeable in the rise of neuroscience from the 1960s onwards, and in the revival of genetics. Genetics had been largely discredited in the mid-1940s after the collapse of Hitler's regime, when it emerged that leading German psychiatrists had been involved with the program, first of all, to compulsorily sterilize the mentally ill, and then to murder about 250,000 of them. The mentally ill were the first victims of the final solution. It was there that gas chambers disguised as showers were invented. And it was those personnel and those techniques and that equipment that, after it had slaughtered the mentally ill, was moved to the death camps and then used as part of the final solution. So genetics had faded away, but as psychiatry began to swing back to biological interpretations of mental illness, it obviously became a new area of research. Initially through revivals of twin studies and family studies. But then in the aftermath of PCR and the decoding of the human genome, the expectation was that we could finally unlock the genetic basis of schizophrenia, of bipolar disorder, of serious depression. And so that entailed a lot of research and reading on my part into that literature and into the neuroscience that emerged, really to try and explain why how it was that the new psychiatric drugs worked. And so I had to spend a lot of years trying as an outsider to comprehend that literature, and then running what I thought I had found past psychiatrists and other scientists I trusted to say, hey, did I miss something here? Am I overlooking? Have I not grasped what's emerging? Because what was emerging was that the idea that there was a Mendelian gene, for example, for schizophrenia, was completely impossible. It just wasn't supported. And all the candidate genes that were suggested that might work in combination to explain schizophrenia also didn't work. And as we switch to more and more atheoretical but powerful techniques, gene-wide association studies, as they're called, it became more and more apparent that it wasn't even clear that these distinctions that psychiatry has insisted on for 100 years or more, there's something called dementia praecox that later relabeled schizophrenia. There's something called manic depressive illness, now labeled bipolar disorder. There's major depression. That the genetics of these things were incredibly muddled, and as many different genetic loci as we tried to combine together to account for these mental illnesses, explained in a statistical sense, that is, were associated with the outcome, no more than 7 or 8% of the time, adding together hundreds and hundreds of deviations, and that many people with those deviations didn't become mentally ill. So it was just more, it just became a very complicated picture.
One of the things you talk about, I just want to mention your book here because I think you've referred to it, Desperate Remedies, Psychiatry's Turbulent Quest to Cure Mental Illness. One of the things you mentioned in the book is sociological factors.
Yes, well, I think if we look in our contemporary world, I think what's happened over the last 3 years or so is going to drive home the importance of these factors in creating mental illness. The effects of the pandemic and the lockdowns that ensued isolated people. They interrupted the social development of children and adolescents in particular. They interrupted the careers of people embarking on what they hoped was independence from their parents. And they affected old people, of course, who already were at risk of social isolation and disconnection from the wider world, but who now found themselves, even when they were gravely ill, cut off from their family members. And I think we shall see, but there's all sorts of anecdotal evidence and growing concern, I think, among people with a serious interest in these matters, that for very young children, for example, it will be extraordinarily difficult to recapture what they've lost in terms of socialization, learning to be with peers, understanding what it's like to be in a classroom and maintain sort of ordinary sorts of decorum. And one has to worry about that. And it's very interesting. One of the things about American psychiatry, there were a couple of things that made it very, very distinctive, although now it's become, I think, the all-consuming leader of world psychiatry. After World War II, American psychiatry went off in a direction that the rest of the world, except for Buenos Aires, really didn't follow. They embraced psychoanalysis, and for about a quarter century, in the universities, among the social sciences and the humanities, in psychiatry itself, at Hollywood, in movies, in novels, in all sorts of things, Freud's ideas sort of ruled the roost. And psychoanalysis controlled the training of generations of American psychiatrists. One would have assumed in 1965 that their position was almost impregnable. And then, like the Shah of Iran's regime or the USSR, they suddenly collapsed very, very abruptly. So that was another interesting avenue that I tried to pursue. And part of the explanation for that was that even while an affluent post-war America had learned to entrust their psychological troubles of a broader and broader array of things to going to a therapist, there still remained a huge population of people with serious mental illness who were being locked away and treated in America's mental hospitals at public expense. When I say there was a huge array of people, in 1950, there were 500,000. In the mid-1950s, that was about 570 million on any given day. So it was a lot of people That's 570,000. Forgive me. Don't need to add zeros. That was the devalued part of psychiatry. The rich patients, the interesting patients, the patients who still maintain some contact with reality, those were the basis for the new outpatient psychiatry, much of it psychoanalytic or derived from psychoanalysis. But in the hospitals, many of the physicians by now were imported from abroad because this was a low-paid, despised subspecialty. But yet they had this enormous patient population, a huge drain on the public purse. For example, in New York State in 1950, mental hospitals costs absorbed 30% of the current budget of the state of New York, just the single largest expense. And it was in that world, not in the world of academic psychiatry, not in the world of the outpatient psychoanalytic community, that a revolution was being born. That was the advent, by purely serendipitously, purely by matter of chance, not because anybody thought this was the approach to take dealing with those forms of mental illness, but the discovery first of antipsychotics, then of so-called minor tranquilizers like Valium and Librium, and of the first antidepressants, which were found by accident. Somebody was experimenting with drugs to treat serious cases of tuberculosis, something with a very grim prognosis. And when given this drug, the patients became unusually happy. And that was very strange, how to be accounted. And, so in that sense, what was really a side effect became a main effect. We could, it seems, using a chemical, change people's emotional tenor and temper. So the drugs came along. They were mostly used in that setting. Psychiatrists, psychoanalysts rather, either rejected the drugs altogether, which wasn't uncommon, or they said, well, these drugs are useful in damping down florid symptomatology so that we now have access to people and the real work of psychotherapy can proceed. But in effect, the drugs revolution, which began in the mid-1950s, sort of undermined the structure of psychoanalysis, which in any event wasn't having much success treating serious forms of mental illness, and was enormously costly, and was increasingly threatened by the move to managed care. Once insurance companies discovered that psychoanalysis went on for years, if not decades, they weren't terribly pleased to pay for that sort of open-ended, highly expensive treatment. And so it's a bit like a building that the termites are gnawing away at. It looks just fine for a long time, and then suddenly it implodes. And in a certain sense, that's what happened to psychoanalysis. And we can date it fairly precisely. Right at the end of the 1970s, there'd been signs ahead of time, but they'd usually been ignored, as signs of the collapse of the Soviet Empire were ignored. And then suddenly we had to say, well, how did that happen? And when you go back historically, you say, well, yes, this should have been obvious, but it wasn't. So we got a revolution that was partly based on the rise of psychopharmacology, but it was also based on a twin development that happened in the second half of the 1970s, a shift in the way American psychiatry diagnosed mental illness and conceived of mental illness. For psychoanalysts, the symptoms were the least important part of the picture. They were what brought the patient in, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath it, there were all these subterranean, subconscious conflicts going on, giving rise to somebody's symptoms. But beginning in 1980, American psychiatry adopted the exact opposite position. The symptoms were what defined mental illness rather than being just the epiphenomenal manifestations of it. So why did that happen? Well, it happened in part because of psychiatric overreach, and it happened in part because there was growing evidence that psychiatrists couldn't diagnose reliably and validly the illnesses they purported to treat. Now, some of that was internal research within the profession. that was published in professional journals and in some very expensive academic monographs that nobody outside the profession read. Nonetheless, that evidence suggested that psychiatrists barely agreed more often than by chance, that given a particular case, they disagreed. One very famous study presented the same patients to psychiatrists in London and New York, and the results were absolutely drastic. In New York, 60% of the patients were schizophrenic. In London, 20% of them were schizophrenic. In London, a large chunk of them had manic depressive illness. In America, only a very small number did. Well, scientific knowledge is supposed to travel across geographical boundaries. You shouldn't, you wouldn't present somebody and say, has this person got pneumonia or a TB, and get directly contrary results in London and New York. They'd be similar. But that was still internal to the profession. What blew the whole thing open and created a crisis was the publication of an article in the journal Science, one of the two leading general scientific journals in the world, and one that medical journalists often turn to for their stories. And this was a study by a Stanford social psychologist named David Rosenhan, who said he had discovered that psychiatrists couldn't do their basic job of defining mental illness. He called the paper On Being Sane in Insane Places. And he claimed he'd sent a bunch of pseudo patients to a whole array of psychiatric institutions, and they were told they'd been screened to make sure they had no background mental health problems. They were to go in and say, I'm hearing voices, doc, saying thud and empty. And otherwise, they were to behave completely normally. And in his paper, Rosenhan said all of them were admitted, all but one of them was diagnosed as schizophrenic, with the other one in a private hospital was given a slightly more promising diagnosis of manic depressive illness. And it took weeks, in many cases, for them to emerge. And when they were discharged, he claimed, as schizophrenics in remission, a very damning kind of label to carry around. And he said, see, they can't do this. That caused an immense fluttering in the dovecotes. The American Psychiatric Association immediately said, oh my God, what are we going to do? They gathered, they said, we've got to revamp our procedures for diagnosing patients so that we all agree when we're confronted with a patient, because otherwise our legitimacy is shot. Now, there's an interesting coda to that story I've just told. A New York investigative journalist, Susanna Cahalan, recently published a book based on several years of research, some of which I helped on the margins with, showing that this was one of the great social scientific frauds of the 20th century. Now, the fact we now know that doesn't alter the fact that in real time, the study was treated as real, and it created this pressure for a new diagnostic system that relied on symptoms as the basis. So it was a tick the boxes approach. And that has persisted ever since. There have been iterations of what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That was DSM-3, the third edition. In 2013, we got DSM-5, but they all adopt the same approach. DSM-5 was not supposed to do that. DSM-5 was supposed to diagnose mental illness based on findings of genetics and neuroscience, except it turned out they simply couldn't do it. And so they were forced back on the old approach, which led to the then current head of the National Institute of Mental Health, Tom Insel, dismissing the whole thing and saying, we're not going to use this anymore in research. It's a piece of junk. And his immediate predecessor, Steve Hyman at Harvard, to say, this is a scientific disaster in the way these people simply don't understand. So there was huge criticism, and yet in reality, the profession still clings to this because it's what they've got. And diagnosis is a very important thing. I know from my work in the 18th century that families came to a mad doctor, as they were then called, because they had experience. They could put what looked like suffering, like something no one else had ever experienced, into context, could say, well, if you're depressed like that, there are other people with that same set of feelings. They could provide reassurance, provide a label, which gave some sense to people that what they had was understood and was being researched and might lead somewhere. And the same thing is true in the present. We have to have some guideposts for treatment. We have to have some way of reassuring patients. And so, notwithstanding the problems with the DSM, it very much persists in the present.
That brings me to something you've talked about, and I think the DSM-5 is one of those issues. You have 5 big ideas in the field of mental illness, and I thought you could go through some of those ideas for our listeners.
Sure. So I think one of the things I found looking at over 200 years of American psychiatry was that over and over again, the mentally ill proved extraordinarily vulnerable to fads, to experimentation, to being bodies that were subject to interventions that often turned out in retrospect to be singularly harmful. And rather than leaving that as an abstraction, let me talk a bit about some of that. So in the early 20th century, late 19th century too, psychiatry was faced with a problem. It wasn't able to cure very many patients. Some patients got better. It's important to remember that. But the asylums had silted up with chronic patients who stayed there year after year, in some cases decade after decade. And that really was the public image of mental illness as a hopeless condition. That was the sort of approach that justified the asylum as a way to keep these people from breeding, from adding to the numbers of the mentally ill. It was what ultimately led to compulsory sterilization, which my state, California, took the lead in. It sterilized more people than any other US state and didn't stop the process until about 1960. But for many psychiatrists, going down that route was a deeply uncomfortable thing. They saw themselves as healing professionals. And yes, if mental illness was rooted in the body, that made it difficult to treat, but perhaps not impossible. And so experiments developed to try to find a way to alleviate and cure. That's the subtitle of my book about the psychiatrist's struggles to cure mental illness. And so this was an era where medicine had joined the laboratory, had discovered the bacteriological origins of many kinds of disease. And it was thought that perhaps other diseases that hadn't yet had their germ origins discovered would yield to the same paradigm. And there was something that happened in psychiatry that led to considerable excitement about that. One of the few diagnostic triumphs of 19th century psychiatry was to discover something called general paralysis of the insane, or general paralysis. This was discovered in the 1820s in France. And there was much speculation about whether that was the end state of all psychosis or whether it was a separate condition. And as the century wore on, there was more and more conviction it was something separate, and more suspicion about its origins, suspicions that were confirmed in the early 20th century. It was discovered that this was actually the outcome of infection with syphilis. Syphilis in its primary stages is very visible and painful and obvious, but then it goes underground, sometimes for decades. Sometimes it attacks other vital organs, the heart in particular, and people drop dead of a heart attack in their 40s. Everybody assumes they've just had middle-aged heart attack, but in fact, it was the effect of syphilitic infection. In other cases, it attacks the central nervous system. It attacks the spinal cord and the brain. And then you get a cascade of psychiatric and neurological symptoms, hence the paralysis. But you also get people believing they're Jesus Christ or Mary, the Mother of God, or Napoleon or George Washington or whatever, or the sexiest man alive, when they're a pitiable wreck of a human being. So having discovered that condition, which was prevalent in about 20 or 25% of male admissions in the early 20th century was actually an infectious illness. The thought was, well, maybe that's true of other mental illness. And it was that led Henry Cotton, one of the best trained psychiatrists of the early 20th century, who'd worked under Adolf Meyer, the leading figure at Johns Hopkins and in Germany, to speculate that chronic infections were poisoning the bloodstream and the lymph and the brain. And that the mental symptoms were just symptoms of this poisoning of the brain. And in a pre-antibiotic era, what you had to do then was engage in what he called surgical bacteriology. That is, go in and remove the offending infected bits, teeth and tonsils. But when patients didn't get better, did you abandon the idea? Oh, no. Obviously, they'd swallowed the germs, so they were now down in the gut. So he started removing stomachs and spleens and colons, and especially cervixes, because women were about 70% of the victims of his approach. And for more than a decade and a half, that proceeded. And indeed, at his hospital, Trenton State, they were still pulling teeth and removing tonsils in 1960 as a method of curing mental illness. Quite bizarre. That turned out to be the first of a whole series of experiments that could be done because when people became mentally ill, they lost their civil rights. They were shut up in a double sense. They were locked away and their voices were stifled. They were seen as the product of their madness. So you could do anything to them. Their families were eager for something to cure them. And so we saw deep sleep therapy using barbiturates. We saw insulin comas. Insulin, one of the great discoveries of the 1920s, could be used to induce comas and put people on the brink of death. Sometimes they did indeed die. Then the thought was that, wrongly, that you couldn't have both epilepsy and schizophrenia. So why don't we create an artificial epilepsy, find some way to create seizures? So we inject them with something called metrazole. And after an interval of several minutes, sometimes as long as an hour, they convulse violently. During that time, as the inventor of this wondrous technique put it, they feel as though they're on the brink of death. Now imagine you're a psychotic person and someone with a white coat comes in and you're strapped down and they inject something into your arm and you feel as though you're about to die. And that persists for minutes, if not an hour or more. And then you convulse so violently, you fracture your vertebrae and sometimes your hip sockets. That was a treatment that supposedly worked and was widely adopted. Seeking a more reliable and humane way of inducing seizures, that's where ECT came from in Italy. And that spread very, very widely. It turns out ECT actually survives now as a treatment, albeit controversially because of its potential effects on memory, among other things. It no longer produces fractures because it's administered now with anesthesia and muscle relaxants and breathing support. But as I say, still very, very controversial. It turns out it's not useful for schizophrenia. To the extent it's useful for, it's for refractory depression. So there's no theoretical basis for it, but anecdotally, it seems to work. Empirically, it seems to, and actually some studies suggest perhaps that it does, at least over the short to medium term. So a lot of these things, and we see the vulnerability of these patients to these kinds of experiments, no ability to resist them. There's a haunting image I have of, which is reprinted of all things in the book promoting psychosurgery by its leading exponent, Walter Freeman, and his sidekick, James Watts. And it's a naked woman being dragged off to be lobotomized, resisting all the way. Women were overwhelmingly the victims of lobotomy. At Stockton State Hospital, as many as 82% of all the lobotomies were performed on women. At the opposite end of the spectrum, at the McLean in Boston, the asylum for the very, very rich and the very, very nervous, again, the majority of patients, 60 or 70%, were women. So you see not only the specific vulnerability of the mentally ill to experiments, but the particular vulnerability, I think, of women and, as it turns out, also African Americans to these kinds of things. And that, with respect to African Americans, that extends all the way down into the present. When we abandoned the asylum, we also abandoned people with serious mental illness. We didn't put into place sheltered housing, social supports, the kinds of relief for families that they would need to cope with the difficulties that brings with it. And now we see huge numbers of the mentally ill cycling between the gutter and the flophouse and the jail, with occasional visits to a psychiatrist to be given pills to try and keep their mental illness under some sort of control. So when asylums were built in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, the idea was we were going to rescue the mentally ill from jails and prisons and from attics and pigsties and put them in therapeutic institutions. Today, the three largest places of inpatient psychiatric care are the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York. And when we look at the jail population in LA, for example, African Americans represent about 9% of LA's population. They represent a little over 30% of the inmates in our prisons here. They are 44% of those with serious mental illness locked up in the jail. So we've sort of, in that sense, come full circle. We've moved from a social policy response was to create separate institutions, supposedly therapeutic institutions for the mentally ill, to rescue them from prisons and jails, back to a situation where prisons and jails are where we put them for extended periods.
That's very interesting. I think you also talk about how community care has failed.
Yes, I think very largely it has. Psychiatrists still tend to believe that it was the advent of antipsychotics that led to the collapse of the asylum, but actually there's lots of evidence that that's not the case. Many states, asylum populations had dropped before the drugs even came along. If you look at the pattern of discharges, overwhelmingly in the late 1960s, that was elderly patients. It wasn't that we found new drugs that worked for elderly patients. It was that we had passed Medicare, and now there was a federal support program, as long as they weren't in mental hospitals. So states rapidly maneuvered to discharge them. Later on, when supplemental security income, SSI, was added to Social Security and didn't require a work history to be given those benefits, that's when younger people started to be discharged. States realized that they could transfer costs from the state budget to the federal budget. And for a time, that sort of worked until two things: the sheer numbers involved and the cutback of federal support via so-called welfare reform, which took place under both political parties, notably Bill Clinton in the late 1990s. So those federal supports weakened. And at that point, we really found we'd moved into a world of homeless mentally ill, of resort to prisons and jails as ways of coping with their more extreme behaviors. And so, yes, I think in very important ways, we've seen the death of public psychiatry. Psychiatry has moved even more towards treating ambulatory patients who can afford to pay, who have insurance that will partially pay for things. And, this is a story of enormous neglect, I think.
Do you think that the pandemic and the resurgence of mental illness is a lost opportunity to revisit some of these debates and look for solutions?
Yes, I do. I think Leon Eisenberg at Harvard once made a very witty and I think quite profound remark. He said, American psychiatry has moved from being a brainless psychiatry to being a mindless psychiatry. In other words, in the Freudian era, any notion that biology might have something to do with mental illness was dismissed as an illusion. And now we're in an era where, by and large, American psychiatry has moved away from psychotherapy, relies almost purely on medications as its response, has delegated such psychotherapy as exists to a different profession, clinical psychology, which is heavily female, and therefore, I should say, as a sociologist, almost as an iron law, less well paid. So they, particularly in the last 40 years or so, we've seen a renewed bet on biology as the whole solution to the problem of serious mental illness. And I think that's a grave mistake. It's not led to any therapeutic breakthroughs. The psychopharmacological industry has abandoned research on new forms of treatment for mental illness. They're far more profitable avenues elsewhere. There are no new ideas about where we might go in terms of creating new classes of psychiatric drugs. So there's nothing to be hoped for really at the moment unless things change on that front. And again, I would say, people will say, well, you're a sociologist. What do you know about these matters? Let me tell you, when Thomas Insel stepped down in the mid 20-teens as head of NIMH, he gave an interview, and he's repeated it recently in his new book, ironically called Healing, where he said, look, I've run NIMH for 13 years or so, and I've spent gobs of money. I mean, I've funded some really cool genetics and some really cool neuroscience, and I spent, around $20 billion. And he said, the situation of people with serious mental illness is just as bad as when I started. Suicides are up, mental troubles are up. We are no closer to having clinical breakthroughs. And what was his prescription? Double down and do more of the same. I hope we won't do more of the same. And I think one of the effects of the current pandemic and the lockdowns is going to bring to the fore once again the notion that the environment powerfully matters. The two other instances in the 20th century where this became starkly apparent, or perhaps three, were World War I with shell shock, World War II, where America's troops were 3 times as likely to break down psychiatrically as in World War I. We tend not to know that. They suffered from combat exhaustion or combat neurosis or whatever. And after the war, there were 500,000 people on psychiatric pensions as a result of their experiences. So war turned out to be not just bad for children and other living things, it turned out to be very bad for soldiers, as indeed was seen in Vietnam, which is what led to the construction of the Ptsd diagnosis, which originally was the product of Vietnam veterans against the war and a couple of sympathetic Harvard psychiatrists who wanted something called post-Vietnam syndrome. And Robert Spitzer, who was in charge of creating the new DSM, wasn't very happy with that because it was politically pretty loaded. And so he said, well, I'll admit that diagnosis, but we'll call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it applies much more broadly. And indeed, over time, it has spread and spread, right? But there we see, under those conditions, a recognition that if somebody is exposed to the horrors of war, or if a woman is raped or sexually assaulted, that provokes profound consequences for their mental health, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, and very understandably so. So there we see a chink, a break with what otherwise is a purely biological or a theoretical account of mental illness, to accept that the social matters. I think what we're going to see with the pandemic and the lockdowns is a further iteration of that, because what it did, it interrupted the socialization of little children. They didn't get to mingle with their peers. They didn't get to learn what it was like to be in a classroom, what the etiquette of being there was like. And it's very hard to recapture after 2 or 3 years of that to catch up. So I suspect they're going to be marked for a long time. Teenagers who are beginning to develop a social life suddenly were cut off from what is a time of experimentation and gradual development of an independent identity separate from their families. People starting out a career, this same problem. They were cut off from either jobs altogether, or their jobs were such that they were isolated. They were working remotely, as they say, which is incredibly difficult. They couldn't strike out and form their own households. If you were elderly, there's always a danger when you're old of isolation and social abandonment. But this was reinforced by the lockdowns. People, even when their loved ones were dying, were not allowed to see them. So all of these things will bring about, I hope and expect, some kind of reassessment of things. And really, beyond that, I would want to argue, and do argue in the book, that this very distinction between the social and the biological is a category mistake. It's just wrong. The idea we can distinguish these two realms and that they don't interpenetrate and fuel one another is absurd. Human beings are a very interesting animal. We're born with a brain that isn't fully formed, that is plastic, and that develops even for decades afterwards. And that development is heavily conditioned by the social circumstances, the cultural circumstances, the familial circumstances in which we grow up. And in a certain sense, the social becomes the brain, because the brain is rewired according to those experiences. And in the same way, the brain conditions social life. So what I would like to see, and if I'm in my more optimistic moments, which aren't as many as I'd like on this front, is that we will see a broadening of research, not such a monistic approach that picks one thing and one thing only. And as well, we'll see an emphasis not just on finding that elusive cure, because I think one of the messages of my book is beware enthusiasts, beware claims that we have a miracle cure, because all too often they turn out to be ill-founded and sometimes the reverse of the truth. But we need also research on how to make the lives of people with serious mental illness and those who are caring for them better, and then provide the kinds of support services that make that possible. And so if I were wishing for a better future, I wish NIMH would stop being so single-minded, would be open to new alternatives. And I wish there was also, because this is a real problem for academic psychiatry, I wish there were a possibility of developing effective psychiatric careers as an academic that didn't depend on R01s, on grants for research that inevitably is about genetics or neuroscience and not necessarily about patient care. It's very, very hard for a young academic to build a successful career without those basic science grants. And so that distorts, what our research priorities are, I think, in important ways.
Thank you, Professor Scull. That was a very interesting discussion. I have one more question for you. In your survey of mental health systems, be it, have you ever come across a country example where you thought they were doing it better?
I don't think anybody has solved this problem. I think it's an enormously complex, multifaceted problem. I think some societies manage it a bit better than others. There's no utopia out there that I could point you to. I think America is, ironically, given its riches, one of the worst placed developed countries in this respect, because the market ideology is so embedded here. And particularly, I don't like labels like neoliberal, but it does embody a trust in the marketplace and people's individual choices being sufficient to produce effective results. And the problem for people with serious mental illness is that they lack the capacity to earn a living in the marketplace. They lack the resources to buy the things they need. And so we face a stark choice. At the moment, we seem to have opted for a policy of malign neglect. Just ignore them and hope they'll go away. And then some backlash developing as we see. I spend time in San Francisco, but I don't need to, in San Diego and Los Angeles. The problem of the homeless, a substantial fraction of whom are seriously mentally ill, is overwhelming, and it is producing a political firestorm. We've seen the recall of the DA in San Francisco, the recall of school board members. There's even in an ultra progressive city, as it likes to think of itself, I think San Francisco politics are totally weird and not progressive at all in many ways. But, so there's some pressure there. But I think it will be pressure to just kind of move the problem out of sight and out of mind again, rather than a thoughtful way of thinking about, given that these are people who can't compete in the marketplace, who are just incapable of doing so, what are we going to do that will alleviate the problem sufficiently? So I think if you go, I recently lectured in the Netherlands, and I certainly don't think that's a paradise, but by comparison, they have a more effective social safety net than we do. And so their problems aren't as acute as the ones we confront here.
Well, that was a very interesting exposition on mental health. Thank you for joining us today. And
thank you for having me. The problem, as I said at the beginning, is I started out thinking this was something I'd study for a few years, and it's become a lifetime's obsession. And the chance to talk about why it obsesses me and why it's such a crucial problem for every society I know of, and why we need to pay more attention to it. So the chance to talk about that is enormously welcome. And I thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you very much. And to our listeners, do go out and get Professor Andrew Scull's book. And you can read in more detail some of the issues that he's brought up today. Thank you, and we look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you very much, Neeta. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.